So, Steven Spielberg, he's a beloved director. We all know him. We all love him for his many films. He's one of those directors that you kind of forget the kind of films that he's made into a fashion, like outside of like his most famous ones being, say, I'd say pretty much like from Jaws to Jurassic Park. I'd argue his most famous and notable period, as well as it being the period of him being, showing off himself as a director, being like, I am capable, this is what I can do, making films for kids, all the way from the youngest of ages to adults, and then evolving into a director who can make films also that are very mature for a very adult audience. Not being like sex heavy or violent heavy, but more or less thematically heavy. Say Empire of the Sun, for example. But of course, his most recent, probably 2 decades since the pass of the millennium, we've had more technological films. Stuff that's more of a commentary on society and the system. This comes with Minority Report or even The Post to some extent. And then, of course, you have your most recent film of his being, look at me, I am so hip and square, I'm making films about CGI characters from other movies. That's right, we're talking about Ready Player One. No, we're not talking about Ready Player One in this video. I actually fucking despise that movie. So, yeah, outside of him trying to not look like he's in his 70s, it's interesting to look back at his catalogue of films from I'd say from Jaws to Jurassic Park, and really identify the fact that he's never done a horror film before. Spielberg has never done a horror film. Technically. So yeah, in this video we're going to talk about the horror films of Steven Spielberg. Now, of course, I could talk about all the stuff he did from the late 80s onwards, the more heavy-themed ones, especially like Empire of the Sun, the stuff that talks about kind of the horrors of humanity, but I don't want to, because that's like, I feel like how would you even decide, that's like thematically dark and heavy, like, Schindler's List, that's the one I'm thinking of. Stuff like that, that's kind of, it's about a dark topic, it's about a not very positive topic, but that's not what I really want to talk about, because there's a horror in the context of inside the film, yes, and of course what it represents and what's discussing, so the themes and the context and narrative. But I mean horror film in the case of, look, spooky jump scare. The actual film that would be considered a horror film, whereas Schindler's List would be considered a drama. And I noticed, I have a list of his weird films that he has done that are kind of horror, but not really. Say, for example, his films. Jaws isn't a horror film, it's a thriller. But it has horror elements. It's probably the strongest horror elements I think that he's ever really done in a film. You've got E.T. and Close Encounters, both being science fiction films, but at the same time have this element that they could be horror films, to the point that he produced and arguably directed a lot of, but it really depends on whose perspective you're looking at, with Poltergeist, a film that he did the story for, co-wrote, produced, and was apparently there for the majority of the set. Apparently it was because of, because Toby Hooper directed it. He'd previously done the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So the fact that Spielberg saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre and was like, he went up to Hooper and was like, hey, I want you to do a horror film that I've written. And of course, Spielberg could not direct it because in his contract for E.T., he could not direct another film. Now, originally, Poltergeist was meant to be, Poltergeist was meant to be this kind of he'd written it as a sequel, a horror sequel to Close Encounters. So this obviously implies that he has intended to do a horror film in his time as a director. Of course, he never ended up directing the film, but I guess it depends on who you want to look at. Says, oh, no, he was there every day. Hooper would set up the shots, tell people what to do, and Spielberg would be like, nope, I want you to do it like this, and change the shot and do that instead. So I'm not going to say that Hooper didn't direct it. I'm definitely going to say Hooper did, because even Spielberg himself says that Hooper did. Of the open letter and stuff like that. But the point being is the fact that Spielberg didn't direct it. And I find it interesting that this is probably the most horror film that Spielberg did. And he did a lot of Spielberg Presents, like Gremlins, for example, which is known as a black comedy horror film. Which we all know Gremlins, the little fucking Mogwai gizmo sprouts creatures that kill everyone. It's awesome. And I think he produced the second one. I know Joe Dante directed both of them, but at the same time, I'm very sure Spielberg, but then the second one's less of a horror, more of a comedy. It's a satire. It's very good. I argue it's better than the original, but depends on what kind of audience you're looking at. So then you have these Spielberg Presents things. Which of course is him being like, oh, I'm producing or executive producing a whole bunch of films that I really like the ideas of, and I really think need the funding or whatever, and I can put it under my Amblin brand potentially. And then you have, what was that other film he did? Yeah, I think it was an adaptation of, Twilight Zone the movie. He directed a segment of it. Kind of ironically, he directed the only non-horror segment. It's like, oh yeah, an old dude moves into a retirement home village and allows pretty much everyone there to be able to live their glory days as a child, and then one of them decides, at the end of the night, everyone decides to become, because they have this whole the mortality factor, my family won't recognize me, all this kind of stuff. But still, one of them decides to be young and moves on with their life, and everyone else just stays old in a retirement home. And it's like the message about, just because you're old doesn't mean you're old. And, it's nice. It's a very Steven Spielberg kind of thing. It's a heartwarming message. It's very nice. It's very nicely done in a horror film. But still. So, again, he directed a segment, but still not a horror segment. Every other segment, horror. At least from my recollection, every other segment was a horror thing. I'm very sure it all was, because I did not remember that whole entire segment that Spielberg directed, because everything else is more interesting, probably because it was horror. This one was more like Cocoon, if it was a 15-20 minute short film kind of thing. Probably not even that. But then of course you have his still kids films, because this is still when they were arguing about the whole PG and R thing. It's like, there was no PG-13 at the time, so you had stuff like Gremlins and Poltergeist and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, another Spielberg film, which is definitely the most horror-eccentric of the Indiana Jones films. Because arguably only the first two have horror elements, and the first one's horror elements are the whole final act on the island with the ghosts, and that's just... It's scary because of the effects and what happens to the people, but it's not a horror film because it's an action-adventure film. It's like, this is what happens. It's the kind of ironic nature of the film, I guess. Not really. It's just how crazy an adventure of Indiana Jones can get. And Temple of Doom is more horror in everything else, from the themes of slavery and poverty and all that kind of stuff. So the more adult themes, but also the factor of the guy who pulls the heart out of everyone else, which was horrifying for me as a child. I hated watching that. It was so scary. It's like, dude, you're literally ripping a dude's heart out of his chest, which is meant to be the intended effect, of course. It's spooky, but again, not horror. And I feel like this is all relevant. What exactly is the point I'm getting at? We get it. Spielberg hasn't directed horror films, but then Jaws, Thriller, very much feels like a horror film. Then, of course, you have Jurassic Park, which is, I feel like, his culmination of what became a proper horror film. To the point that I have friends, and by friends I mean people who were still teenagers when the film first came out, and they were able to say, yeah, no, it scared me when I was a kid. You know, it scared me when I went to the theater and watched it. It scared me too when I watched it. Like, same as Jaws. Jaws, the whole idea of it scared me so much I never watched it till I was about 12 or 13. The point is, I was still scared by both of these two films, Jaws and Jurassic Park. Because Jurassic Park had fucking dinosaurs in it. And they were scary. Hell, I even dreaded watching The Lost World, and I don't think he directed that. I mean, even if he did, still horror enough. Like, it has an atmosphere around it. It's a creature feature. You know, it's very reminiscent of the stuff from, like, you know, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Dracula and all that kind of stuff. It kind of heritage itself, you know, it kind of has this reflection of these films, of being like, you know, these are the horror films back of the day, and we're kind of making this creature feature thing come back in a way. Of course, it's 20 years apart, you know, from him doing Jaws in the mid to late 70s, and then you have Jurassic Park in 92. But still, the Tyrannosaurus Rex was scary. The fucking frilled-neck lizard thing that killed... now I feel bad that I can't even remember... Newman, that's his name. I mean, the fact that he killed Newman, like, it's scary, you know? The raptors weren't exactly scary, which I find the most interesting part. I mean, outside of when, you know, pokes her head out of the bush, clever girl, you know, that whole scene, spooky. Spooky when supposedly Samuel L. Jackson's hand, I mean, I love that. What was it? There was like a sketch I saw where it's like Samuel Jackson comes back to life in the movie, in like Jurassic World, I think it was. It was like the How It Should Have Ended or whatever, and he's back, and they're like, what? How did you survive the first film? And he's like, what, just because it's a black guy's hand means it was mine? I find that amusing. Same point. Assuming that it is Samuel Jackson's character's hand, which most likely it was, that was still scary, you know? Oh, look, it's a comforting hand. You know, it's scary. But I think, would you consider Jurassic Park a horror film? Because I think, as much as Jaws isn't a horror film, it's definitely a thriller. I mean, it still is a horror film in its own right. And so is Jurassic Park. Hell, I'd argue they both are. Maybe if he directed The Lost World, I don't even know. I should look that up, just to clarify. But, like, the point being is that I don't really think he has directed a horror film, but because, of course, realistically, he hasn't. And I mean, Poltergeist is probably his closest example of directing one, but he didn't exactly direct it because he didn't actually direct it. So if you cut that out of the picture and be like, no, it's just a writing credit, very Spielberg. Everything about the film is Spielberg. Like, nothing about it feels like a Tobe Hooper film, which is strange, but at the same time, I've never really gotten an essence of what exactly is a Tobe Hooper film. I don't know, but at the same time, Jaws, thriller over horror. You'd probably argue that instead. And because it's not really about the scares, but then you don't really need it to be about the scares, it's about the people. That's like, I don't know, I mean, Halloween arguably still is, but not really. Yeah, shit, he did direct The Lost World. So, I mean, that's arguably a horror film, not really. But say the opening of Jurassic Park, where they have, they've captured the raptor, and it eats the guy alive. It's just, it's scary shit. So I would still very much say, that Jurassic Park is a horror film. Out of all of his films, I'd say that's probably the most likely to be considered a horror film. Jaws, arguably so. It has enough of the horror elements, and it still works as a compelling narrative, a compelling character study. Everything about it really works, especially if you look at it as the classic creature feature. But it doesn't just have to be the creature feature. Like, it's like Alien, but it's in the water, on a beach, on an island, by itself. It's pretty much Alien, except it's a shark instead of a xenomorph. Yeah. So yes, I think the moral of today is Spielberg has done at least 2 horror films. Not exactly actually labeling them as horror films, but I mean, how the hell would you not? It's the fun of it, because yeah, you'd label Jurassic Park and even a family adventure film. You totally would label that as a family action adventure film because it's about kind of a family, but I mean, realistically, it is about a family. It's about two different families colliding, and then Jeff Goldblum is like their uncle, and he's like the really cool dude. And then there's the lawyer, because every family has a lawyer. Um, and yeah, it's just it's interesting. I very much would say that Jurassic Park and arguably The Lost World, but I'm not really going to get into that. But definitely Jaws and Jurassic Park are horror films. Poltergeist, I probably would easily argue it to... Hell, I'd get it confused with a Spielberg film. If I bought the Blu-ray at some stage, I'd be like, yeah, this is a Spielberg film. Arguably, I'd put it into a Spielberg collection if I didn't have a Hooper... If I had a Hooper collection, I'd put it in there, yes, but, like, everyone would think Poltergeist is a Spielberg film. Because it has... The fingerprints is all over it, you know? It's like King Kong from the 20s. He's got fingerprints all over him. It's so obviously a Spielberg film, from the fact of the location, the family, the neighborhood, the way it's pretty much been shot, the kids on the bikes, bloody everything about it. It's a horror film. Obviously, Poltergeist is a horror film, but it definitely feels like a Spielberg film. So, yeah. I don't really know how to wrap up this video. I guess, open for discussion if you guys think that, if you have a different film of his that you think is more of a horror film, something that's, I guess I'm more thinking of the ghost story, the creature feature, because arguably, yes, a lot of his later films definitely have horror elements because, of course, it's the thematics, but it's more of, I'm thinking, the active principle, like Schindler's List has horror elements because of just like the kind of horrifying effect of the whole entire film, but at the same time, it's a drama, whereas Jurassic Park is like literal horror jumping at you, and then also action adventure fun because it's dinosaurs, and dinosaurs totally won't eat you. Totally. Yeah, so I don't know. I'd like to hear your impression in the comments. So feel free to comment what you think. If you think I'm just completely wrong and you're just like, dude, no, he has never done a horror film, then that also is in itself a point. He's never actually done an official horror film. Or I haven't gone enough into his filmography to know. But I'm very certain I have. Because it's a very confusing filmography. So that's fun. Yeah, so guess that's it. So yeah, feel free to like, share, subscribe for more. If you want more videos about this where I'm just kind of open thought process about something. I'm mostly doing these because this is of course October and it's the month of horror, so I'm kind of getting into that mindset and that mood. Yeah, cool, alright. So yeah, feel free to like, share, and subscribe for more. Bunch more videos on this channel, especially for October for horror, because I really like horror, and I hate that I have to wait till October to talk about it. It's dumb, dude. I love horror. I watch it all the time. Cool, bye. What do you think of my Jurassic Park shirt? It's Japanese. I like it too.